First of all, Matt, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast, and thank you so much for joining us today. And I guess to start, I just wondered if you could give us a quick introduction, who you are, what you've accomplished. I know there's a lot you've accomplished, so everyone's got a bit of an idea. And then we'll talk about your fantastic book, which I recommend everyone gets a copy of.
Accomplishments is always a hard one. I'm a dad. So having kids always feels like the big accomplishment. Although, it's a Tuesday and getting them out the door felt like the accomplishment today. So my name is Matt Wallaert. I've been an applied behavioral scientist since before we used those words. So I am a social psychologist by training. My undergrad was in psych and education. I went off to grad school to a social psych PhD program and then left to join a startup as their head of product. And so I think this was in the early 2000s. I think people were starting to recognize that, the combination of psychology and product was a very powerful one. Mm-hmm. My first company was a personal finance company.
Okay.
We were kind of Mint's biggest competitor. We sold to Lending Tree. And it was really wonderful to get this sort of crash course in how do you build product at a startup while trying to change human behavior? Because ultimately every product tries to change human behavior.
Right.
From there, I went on to sell another product, went off to Microsoft to be their head of behavioral science, and then Clover Health as their chief behavioral officer, took them public, and then became the global head of behavioral science at Frog Capgemini. And these days, I run an organization called Behavioral Science in Organizations, bsci.io, which is sort of a unique consultancy. We sort of do, as far as I know, we're the only ones that do it in the world. We basically set up behavioral science teams for other companies.
Oh, cool.
And so it's a collection of people who have run big behavioral science teams inside of generally for-profit companies. And we don't do any project work. So Jay couldn't come to me and say, Matt, we want people to get flu shots. Can you get people flu shots? Right. We don't do that. We'll refer you off to, Ideas 42, BIT,
right.
Any of a number of really great organizations.
Right.
And in return, we only focus on, hey, if you want to build a team or upskill your existing folks, that's what we do. And that's, if you ask about an accomplishment, Jake, at least in the realm of behavioral science, I think the part that I feel most proud of is really this organizational development part, right? Pioneering this idea of sort of what is a chief behavioral officer? How do we build these teams? How do they integrate organizations? What kind of education prepares people for that?
Right.
That how do we scale behavioral science is always the part that I'm sort of most interested in, most proud of, always pushing forward. And that's where the book came from. So I had really no intention of writing a book, but a very persuasive publisher made me an offer I can't refuse. And so the book came out. But again, the book was really, it's not nudge, it's not the phenomenology of sort of behavioral science. It's how do we have a process-driven approach to behavior as an outcome and science as a process.
Awesome. Well, I think you've accomplished a lot anyway. Even if you don't feel that way
You
yourself.
And my 8-year-old, every day he says, "Dad, you're the greatest dad." And I'm like, I appreciate that, buddy. You are the greatest son.
I have a 3.5-year-old son, so a little bit behind yours, but it's awesome. Awesome experience.
The best is yet to come, my friend. I promise you. The older they get, the cooler they get, the more they can communicate with you. You can use behavioral science on them. They can use behavioral science on you. You can both use behavioral science on your partner. It's great.
Yeah, no, it's a powerful skill. Before we chat about the book, I did a little bit of background research, and I was wondering, I think I get this right, but you grew up in rural Oregon and now you live in sunny San Diego, which I'm very jealous about. But I think you ended up studying college in Hong Kong. Is that right?
I did.
Wow, how did you end up in Hong Kong from rural Oregon?
Yeah, I've sort of ended up on the West Coast, but via a long circuitous route. So I got this great opportunity to go off to the United World Colleges, which are a program of schools, mostly 2-year schools, where you're doing the international baccalaureate somewhere around the world. And so I got this great scholarship to go to Hong Kong, which was obviously quite different than rural Oregon. You can't really see height on the web very well, but I'm a rather tall white dude. And so I sort of showed up in Hong Kong and was like, oh, well, this is different. Yeah. And it was great. And I went to school with kids from 80 countries who I still am very good friends with, around the world. I get a chance to speak around the world a lot. And so I get a chance to see my friends in different countries, which is fun. And from there, I went off to college on the East Coast, and then spent a long time of my career in New York City.
Okay.
The first startups were in New York City when startups were still very much a fledgling thing.
Right.
I was in Seattle for a few years for Microsoft, and then ended up running up Microsoft Ventures in New York City. So I went back. And then I kind of crash landed in San Diego during the pandemic. We happened to be away from New York when the pandemic sort of started. And so we just sort of ended up staying. And so that's how I sort of ended up in San Diego, which is lovely. My brother's in San Francisco, although not in tech. Nice. He's a writer. And so I get to be closer to my family. My parents are still very much in Oregon. And so
that's nice. So it's not, in US terms, it's not a million miles away, I guess.
It's not a million. I mean, certainly, everywhere in the UK feels much closer together, right? It's quite lovely. The ability to get places and see people. It's been a very, very long time since I've lived. I left home when I was 15 and 42. And so for my parents, it's very, very powerful for them after 25 years to have their boys back. Yeah, I imagine. Back on the coast and able to see their my brother also has two kids. So that's awesome. See all their grandsons and, it's quite fun. Parents
always happy to have you back. I was living overseas in Australia for 5 years. And I think my parents were worried that I'd end up, staying there forever. So I'm very happy to see you come back.
And that's a long flight, my friend.
Yeah, it's a long way. I mean, it's funny because it is a long way, but at the same time, it's only 24 hours. And you think, well, that's only a day, right? But yeah, psychologically, there's probably some insight there that it feels way more than a day, if that makes sense.
So I've given a lot of talks in Australia. They like behavioral scientists, I am convinced that they are themselves behavioral scientists because you can always tell Australian conference organizers because they always ask you to speak about a year in advance. They're like, will you come and speak in, Australia next fall?
Oh, wow. Okay.
I don't do anything next fall. If you ask me now about the future, right, like because of, sort of hyperbolic discounting and things like, sure, whatever, right? Yeah. Like, and then inevitably about a week beforehand, I look at my ticket, that they've sent me and go, wait, how long is this flight? Like, what is happening right now? And the thing that trips me out psychologically is the sleeping once, but 2 days past. Yeah. So you get on the plane. You're right. It's, it's a 20-hour flight, which I can do. Yep. But you only kind of sleep once in that period. And then, but magically when you get there, it's 2 days later. Yeah, I was in Australia and I was flying into Sydney, and on a very, as you know, this is not common. Sydney was fogged in, which is not typical. Right. And so they redirected us off, they're basically like, we can't circle. We don't have enough fuel for that, right? Like there's a transatlantic flight. Like we cannot circle here endlessly. Yeah. So they redirected us up the Gold Coast, but the Gold Coast airport did not have any kind of immigration, so they couldn't let us off the plane. And they also did not have a jet bridge that would go to the size of plane that we are. Oh, wow. So we're just like parked on this runway, and you can see people like stopping on the side of the highway and like taking pictures of our like giant plane in this tiny airport. Wondering what you guys are doing. That caused me to miss my first talk. And for that entire trip, because I just sort of like missed the beginning, I was always like, wait, what is happening? Where are we? Like, what days? I was supposed to give like 8 or 9 talks over the course of 6 days. Oh, wow. And that's a lot. I just like couldn't. Lost the whole time. I flew back through Hawaii, and it's the opposite problem going the other way, right? You're like sort of left before you get back before you leave, or very nearly thereafter. Yeah. And I sort of just have blanked out that week of my life is gone. It's lost in the ether. Yeah, no, I loved Australia, but it was time to come home for all sorts of reasons. But what took you there? I just wanted a change of scene. I think I was in my current job, which I'd been doing for a while, and I enjoyed the industry. I was in the advertising industry, and I enjoyed what I was doing. But I just sort of had that moment where I was sitting at my desk one day, and I thought, if I don't make a change, I'll probably be sitting at the same desk in like 2 years' time, and do I really want to be in that position? Probably not. And in the UK, I think it's changing now, but before you're 30, you could get a 1-year kind of working visa to Australia, and I think New Zealand as well. So I was like, I think I was 28, 29 at the time, and I was like, if I don't do this, I'm going to lose that opportunity. It was funny, like, because again, on the sort of behavioral science
side, I heard this thing called 9 enders. Have you heard about this? Where like when your age ends in 9, you're quite likely to make big shifts or changes in your life because you're kind of reflecting it's the end of a decade, the start of a new one. And apparently there's all this research around people making big life decisions. And I thought about it with my own life. And 19 is when I took a year out after high school before I went to college. 29 was when I went to Australia. 39 was when I got married and had my son. So it's kind of weird, but apparently it's a thing. Nine enders.
Well, seasonality effects are certainly key. It's very, I looked at my resume recently and was like, the number of jobs that I've started in sort of like October, right? Like October is clearly the month when like people decide that like they need to hire Matt Wallaert because for some reason like that is always, it's like this long string of Octobers. And I was very interested in this seasonality phenomenon. I was discussing it with another behavioral scientist who formerly is of Spotify, who looks a lot at like sort of the fresh start effect and things because Spotify wants you to listen. And so there's quite a lot of experimentation around sort of like, we used to have this notion of an album, right? Which was a very set, like sort of, it had a beginning and an end and you listen to it all the way through and it had sort of an arc. And now we don't really have that, but we do have podcasts, right? Mm-hmm. And so getting all the way through an episode, getting all the way through a season, right? Is it better to, let's say you stop in the middle of an episode, not that anyone would ever stop in the middle of your podcast, Jake, like clearly everyone's going to make it all the way through this podcast. But if you did have to stop in the middle and we want to re-engage you, is it better to say, hey, let's get you sort of back into this episode? Or is it better to say, hey, let us get you a clean episode?
Right.
And it's those sorts of like, time is a very funny concept for humans. And I'm always fascinated by the ways that we construct ourselves, even though it's entirely artificial, right? It's irrational. Every second is just like every other second. Every microsecond is just like every other microsecond. But it's 5 o'clock. Transition. It's a new day. Transition. Right. It's a new week. Transition.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, when you were mentioning hyperbolic discounting, I was thinking of this great book on climate change I read ages ago, and it was, I can't remember what the title was, but the idea was like, why is it so hard for us psychologically to kind of embrace this topic and do anything about it? And there's this fascinating study with young mothers who basically had or did less in terms of the changes they could make towards a more sustainable lifestyle. So, whether that was recycling or cutting down on plastic products or whatever it was, compared to childless people or couples. And the theory is that when you're a young mother or young parent, you're so preoccupied with just getting your kid fed and clothed, and so you just don't have the mental capacity to think about this way off problem in the future, and everything is kind of hyper focused and hyper concentrated, even though you might think logically you should be more concerned about the environment because that's the future your child's going to grow up in. So I thought that was really interesting, and that seems to be so true for so many things, like saving money for the future.
Myopia is like that, right? It really does narrow us in on things. And one of my favorite Shakespeare quotes is my poverty but not my will consents, right? It's a very short act late in the play, kind of stuck in there as a plot point because Romeo needs to figure out dying, and so he goes to this apothecary. It's one of the shortest acts in the whole play, but it has that really punchy, he's sort of, the guy doesn't want to sell him the poison, right? But sort of says like, but I'm poor and my kids are poor and my kids rely on me, and so I guess I sell you this because you're rich and you'll pay me for it. Right. I think people, that actor observer bias, that tendency to think, it's so easy to look at, people who don't have access to money, don't have access to opportunities and say, well, they're lazy and they're this and they're that, and pass all of these judgments that just aren't true. Right. The reality is, inter-individual differences are relatively small compared to sort of situational differences. And for so much of us, my poverty, but not my will consents. My
Mm.
son came home last night and he had some work he needed to finish up from his classroom.
Mm-hmm.
He has some fine motor difficulties, so writing
Right.
takes a very long time.
Right.
So we're working our way through this homework. And I'm going, man, I don't want to, I don't want to be this person, right? Like, this is not how I want to spend my time with my son.
Right.
But, the needs of the moment just totally dominate your best intentions.
Yeah.
And at some point we finally just said, well, screw it. We're not going to finish it. We're going to go swimming instead. We went up to the pool, went swimming.
Nice.
And he was laughing and I was laughing and we were having such fun. And, it's so hard to break out of those, what feel like immediately circumstantial constraints that cause us to have behaviors that are very perverse, and perverse here in the sense of like, they're not what our intended sort of values are.
Right. Yeah.
As your kiddo gets older, you'll get more of this. This just happens. And what I understand from people who have kids slightly older than mine is it just gets worse and worse. So.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. I find that hard as a parent. I mean, he's still in kindergarten now, but, that difference between, wanting to kind of discipline them and tell them about the social rules and things like that, and just letting them have fun and, do whatever, just be kids. And he's going to be going to school next September, which he's not going to be even 5 then. It just seems so crazy to put him into that classroom, formal environment, the role of the teacher versus the students. It's just kind of wild. But yeah,
my son is very into rock music right at the moment.
Okay, cool.
And so we were listening to Pink Floyd, and I was trying to explain, he was like, listen to this song in which the chorus is like, hey, teachers, leave those kids alone. Like, we don't need no education. And I was trying to explain to him, the British system that Pink Floyd was reacting against, and sort of what is rote learning, and sort of like all of these things that, how you and I were educated is totally different than how our kids are being educated. I mean, we just are so much better at educational pedagogy than we once were. Right. And even as we like struggle here in the US with it, as like, unfortunately conservative Christians, try and make a return to some versions of rote learning. You still look at like, even the thing they're advocating for is like, would have been extraordinarily liberal 100 years ago, right? Like the thing the conservatives are trying to get us to do now would have been extraordinarily, because the Overton window has shifted, right? Like this notion of like what is acceptable or not. So I was just trying to explain to my son what rote learning was, because I don't think there's a single thing he's rote learned. Like I don't, it's just not a.
Well, it's crazy.
That's not how they do education.
No, and then like in a world where you can Google anything, what's the point of remembering, the names and dates of obscure battles from the 15th century? It's just not worth it. But I was going to ask you. Oh yeah, fun fact on the Pink Floyd, the song you were talking about. It's a chorus that's sung by the kids. The one you were just mentioning, and the kids that sung that chorus were from the primary school at the bottom of the road where I grew up in London. So that's a random fun fact for the day.
That is fantastic. Did it cause you to reject schooling, or did you?
No, but I mean, I love Pink Floyd. It's one of my favorite bands of all time, and I mean, when you listen to that song, there's a lot of truth in it, and I do worry about, to some degree, my child being educated in the system, because although it is progressing and getting better, there's still a lot of still a lot about it that I don't think is helpful, especially for the world we live in. And there are a lot of skills that I wish they taught them at school, things like problem solving, creative problem solving, decision making, negotiation, all of these skills that are actually relevant to life, even personal finance. Like there's no, formal education in personal finance, which is absolutely crazy, because, you become this adult and then suddenly you're meant to figure out how to do your finances and how to make good decisions. And, as like we're not set up to deal with money. It's like we're our own worst enemies when it comes to money, and, especially with things like saving for the future and, investing and all that sort of stuff. And it's amazing that no one teaches you any of this, and you're meant to just figure it out. But some people, they just don't figure it out because it's not something they're interested in, and they don't have the motivation. But it's kind of like the fundamental thing that underpins your life, right? Whether you are motivated by money or not doesn't really matter. It's very hard if you don't have enough money. If you're worrying about money, I mean, that point you made about, people being lazy, a lot of the time people in difficult financial circumstances, they lose their cognitive bandwidth because they're so much is taken up by just focusing on the here and now and getting enough money to make rent, or that actually that can make them seem more stupid than they are. And that would be the same thing for anybody else if they had that constant stress and pressure on them.
I think it's hard.
Yeah,
it's hard for people to appreciate. I think
so. I think so.
I'm always really interested in sort of revealed preference, right? And one of the great revealed preferences of my life is that, I'm a first generation college kid, and I gravitate often towards other people who also, have had the experience of
right.
social climbing in a particular kind of way. And it is one of those things that nobody ever really, there've been a few false starts on making dating apps that try and match you up via credit score and those sorts of things. And I don't think that's quite the right approach. No. There is something very fundamental, when the first startup, because it was in personal finance, I talked to a lot of people about money, and there's some great research that shows that the only thing that couples fight about more than sex is money. Right. And anytime, given human procreation drives, anytime something trumps sex in the world, you should pay attention to it, and I think we often get bogged down in the we should offer personal finance for logistical reasons. But I would be offering it as part of mental health, right? If you look at a huge 100%. Number of suicides, you look at stress, you look at spousal abuse, you look at all of these different things that are so both correlated and causally related to the stresses that come out of finance. That, if we could just, there's no surprise, should be no surprise to anybody on this podcast if you've done even a casual search of me. I am not shy about my sort of feminist populist leanings. I think things like guaranteed minimum income and other kinds of things that relieve some of that financial stress. And I don't mean financial stress I think we would say financial stress and people think of it like the physical feeling of stress and those sorts of things, or stress on this. No, I mean emotionally damaging to people. Right. You're I sleep like a rock. But I tell you, if I'm up at 3 a.m., it's probably because I'm worried about some financial thing.
Right. And I think I'm right in saying that it's also one of the leading causes of divorce, I think, financial issues between couples. As you say, it underpins everything. I think it's a fundamental thing, and I'm kind of amazed that it's not taught in school, along with all these other skills that are actually useful. I can't think of anything that I learned at school that's I use in my day-to-day.
Well, I think of lots of things. The fact that I can talk to you loquaciously now is partially influenced by my schooling. I can write, math.
That's true.
I appreciate school. Education is. I have an education degree. I believe very strongly in education.
That's true.
But I think so much of it has to do not with what we're taught, but how we're taught.
Yeah.
And there's not enough. One of the key failings of education is that that crops up in many places, in behavioral sciences, teachers are focused on knowing. Right. And in reality, education is about doing. Right. It's about, I am trying to produce a set of behaviors in Jake. What can I do to produce the set of behaviors in Jake that are socially desirable and good for people and good for Jake and good for the world? Right. It's not about knowing about personal finance. It's about doing a set of things that will set you up in a good place. And knowing makes you more likely to do those in some ways. But, a great example is here in the US, we have to fill out our taxes, and they're relatively complicated. And if you know more about them, you can sort of exploit loopholes in them to, whereas other countries where they're here is your tax bill. We know all all the money goes through us. It's our money. Here's your tax bill, pay your tax. They don't rely on people's
Right.
sort of circumstantial ability to manipulate the system and that just, simple things like that. We don't have to put all of the onus on the individual knowing things. We can just set up systems that take care of folks in smart ways. And we actually have plenty to do that, right?
Yeah.
Like we have plenty of money and plenty of resources worldwide to take care of people in a reasonable way.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. The difference between knowing and doing, because after all, you can know a lot, but if you don't apply it, then it's kind of useless, right? But I guess we better talk a little bit about your amazing.
We have to talk about the actual podcast. Whoever is listening to this out there, I promise we'll get to the questions at some point.
Exactly. But yeah, the first question I wanted to ask is, why did you call it Start at the End?
I didn't.
Okay.
So one of the great mysteries of publishing. So when we were building the first startup, Avi Karnani, who was our CEO's roommate, was a writer. And he's gone off to be quite successful. He got an Academy Award for a screenplay. Like he's quite a successful writer. But at the time, he was writing his first book. And he wrote a book that in the US is called The Sherlockian. And it's a book about Sherlockians are like people who study and are into the sort of, in the same way that some people are into anime, some people are into Sherlock Holmes.
Right.
Sherlockians.
Yep.
And it's like a murder mystery set around Sherlockians, the Sherlockian community.
Cool.
In the UK, for no apparent reason, it is called The Holmes Affair. And it just turns out, he hates that title, but it just turns out that your publisher kind of gets to call it whatever the hell they want. Like that is one of the, as you like divide up the responsibilities of thing. I believe my title for the book was something like, the Handbook of Applied Behavioral Science or something, like it was some extraordinarily boring handbook-based title. And in this case, they certainly know their job. Start at the End is a much better title. And I was very happy when they revealed the art and things. And then it actually we were struggling with the title. The whole book was written. We were struggling with the title. And I remember going to tacos near the office, near the publisher's office with my editor. And she and I were just working over lunch, just trying to find it. And I think she suggested that title. We were like, she's like, what are you trying to convince people? And I'm trying to convince people that like they should start by articulating the behavior that they want at the end. And she's like, great, start at the end.
Right.
And I was like, okay.
Kind of makes sense.
Because I do think I believe very powerfully in science, right? So when I talk about behavioral science, right? So I take each word very serious. Applied as opposed to academic, right? I'm not looking for generalizable knowledge. I'm looking for in situ, contextual, right? Changes behavior in the circumstances in which I care about. So applied. Behavioral, like everything's about behavior, and then science as a process. But I do think that you can't get to science without behavior, right? Because if you don't articulate, here's the behavior that we want as an outcome, then you can't run an experiment because the experiment becomes immeasurable, right? You can't say alternative A is better at creating an outcome than alternative B is if you don't have an outcome, like a fair ruler that you're using to measure those two things, right? And this has been historically exploited through business, right? So Jake's the most powerful person in the room, and he kind of manipulates the way that we measure outcomes to make sure that the option that he wants is chosen by the data, right, of the outcome that he wants. But he's manipulating the way that we're measuring the outcome post hoc, right? So by at the beginning saying, hey, this is what will be true at the end. It's not in the book, but what I've often started using more recently is I often talk about behavioral science sort of as a genie, right? We are not Aladdin. It is not my job to tell you what behavioral outcomes are desirable. I gave a talk recently in India at a public policy school, and I was talking about public policy folks about two different kinds of public policy, right? There is what outcomes are desirable, right? Which is a huge field of study, right? Should we get kids to study this or that? Should we get kids to do this thing or that thing? Should we get adults to do this thing? Like that's all. What is good for society is a whole different set than, given that is true, how do we make those outcomes happen? Right. Which is where applied behavioral science really shines. Right. And so happenstantially, although it's now been 5 years or so since the book came out, I fall more in love with the title over time because I really do think if you do nothing else, even if you don't use science, just articulating the outcome that you intend, who is going to be doing what and how the hell are you going to measure that? You probably, if you do that, you're, well begun is half done, as Mary Poppins said, right?
Yeah.
Like, and I think over 50% of behavioral science is in the figure out what it is you actually want to be true.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Like when I, first read the title, I sort of had the idea of kind of like reverse engineering in my mind, because it's a similar process, right? You start with the final product and then you try and work out how it was put together. So there's a sort of similar idea there, maybe. But yeah, the next question I wanted to ask you was, you talked a little bit about Spotify and behavioral science, and I just wondered, kind of in all of the experience you've had, what's been your kind of favorite example of behavior change at scale, or the challenge you found most interesting? Because I know that's challenging in itself to scale stuff. Yeah.
I mean, I think depends on what day you ask me, right?
Today.
There is a personality, personality studies have been mostly debunked, but there is a personality scale that I quite like called the Need for Cognition scale, the NFC. I think it's one of the most predictive scales that I've seen. And basically it's just, how much do you like thinking? How much is thinking itself intrinsically rewarding? And the reason I like this scale is it contains items, a lot of scales, it's like, I know what the socially desirable answer is. Need for Cognition, if you did all of the like right answers, they sound sort of crazy. So there are items on there like, I want everything in my life to be a challenging puzzle. No, right? Like that would really be hard, right? Like putting on my pants every morning as a puzzle, right? Not fun.
No.
Right. But there is some part of that. So I just get intrinsically fascinated by sort of all behavior change opportunities. It's perhaps endemic to my nature that the ones that come to mind for me are the ones where we made structural changes with broad impact. So I think about I was at Clover Health as their chief behavioral officer, and we were trying to figure out how do we help our members engage with drug subsidies. So at a state level, there are state programs that can help to make drugs dramatically cheaper so that people take their drugs, which is dramatically important. We can have all of the good drugs in the world. We can have all the good science, but if nobody actually takes the pill, then it doesn't save their life, right? You have to take your statin every day or it doesn't work. And so we were looking at the data, and one of the things that we noticed was that non-English speakers, non-native English speakers, were not engaging in these subsidy programs as much. And so I started poking around, and it just turns out that the form is available in English and only in English, despite the fact that like huge swaths of New Jersey, English is not their native language, right? Particularly older New Jerseyans, right? The people we tend to serve. Yeah. And so we actually translated the form. The only way we could figure out to solve this problem was we translated the form. Then they would send us back the form in Spanish or whatever. And then we would re-enter it onto the English form and then attach the Spanish language form so it had their signature and then submit it for them. But, this is obviously insane. And so working with the public affairs group over the course of like a year, we like pressured some, whoever the hell weird New Jersey office of whatever to like, just translate the stupid form, man. Like the form fields are all the same. So like you could still scan it in and enter it in the database in exactly the same way. You just write the instructions in a different language. It's not that difficult. Here, we've done it for you. Here are like 5 languages that we translated into, like, we had a guy on staff who spoke Korean, so we translated it into Korean. Like we translated it into Spanish. We translated all these versions. So we just gave them to him. And finally, after about a year, they like acquiesced, and now they're available publicly. And did it make good sense for us in business? Absolutely. Right. Absolutely drove the bottom line. Absolutely was helpful, et cetera. But also affected a bunch of people who weren't Clover members. Right. It wasn't just good for our people. I love this sort of rising tide floats all ships sort of thing. Like I can make things better for my members that also happen to make things better for a whole lot of other people. Yeah,
that's great. That's kind of the holy grail, isn't it? To kind of have a huge impact with whatever it is that you're trying to change.
But it's not, it's not the kind of thing that I think people typically think of in behavioral science, right? Like you got some forms translated. It doesn't have the sexiness of like Dan Ariely, you put up a sign and then people do this, like it doesn't look good. And I think that's where behavioral science has sometimes gone astray, is where people sell the sexy parts, right? And the reality of it, someone working in applied behavioral science daily is a hell of a lot of what we do is process optimization. Like it's very not sexy at all, but it results in outcomes that we care about.
Right.
It results in outcomes that we care about.
Yeah. And I mean, working with any large organization, it's always a challenge because you've got the hierarchies and the bureaucracy. And I imagine the reality of doing it is you say it's a lot of kind of like managing relationships and processes and project management. So it probably is a lot less glamorous than it might appear on the surface. There was a really interesting...
Science doesn't work if there isn't the opportunity for failure, right? You have to be able to run, like if every pilot works, you're not doing science, right? Because you're just manipulating the results to support your pilots. Some things have to not work, right? Like that's how the world works.
Yeah.
But so many companies are so risk averse and so career ending to have something not work, right? Or knocks you off your trajectory or whatever. To your point, there's a ton of relationship management, just getting people to the place that they're willing to take a risk on something that just might not work. And that's how science works, is that sometimes shit just don't work. And you gotta be okay with that.
Yeah. Do you think that's one of the reasons why, you say it's hard to get large organizations to kind of take behavioral science seriously? Like, does it feel to them that it's something that's going to end in lots of dead ends and too risky? And
well, it's hard because it's related to lots of other... Man, I'm gonna say something controversial that's gonna get me in trouble with other fields.
That's okay.
I think behavioral science has tries to grow corn in a poisoned field a lot of the time.
Okay, so interesting.
Take bad UX researchers. I'm going to take 6 months and I'm going to produce these 100-page decks with personas and insights that are totally interesting and completely fucking useless. Right? Product managers take one look at them and are like, that's cool, but they don't build anything out of them. There's no science to it. There's no experimentation. It's just my observation, my novel observations about the world, I think. When, we set out as two primary kinds of clients. One of them is companies who already have all the right pieces, but have not managed to make them work together. So arbitrarily, we'll say Google, right? Google has quantitative research, qualitative research, project managers, all the necessary components, but for whatever reason has not managed to make a pipeline where they are like reliably able to change people's behavior across a set of products. This is why only search kind of works, right? So they have all the right pieces. They just can't figure out how to get them together. That's probably half our clients. They're 80% of the way there. They need the last 20%. The other half of our clients have zero, right? Take a big pharma company. They don't have any user researchers. Their quantitative, insights are compared to what we have in tech, like very diminished. They don't have any experimentation capabilities. If they do, they're like focus groups, which we all know are terrible. Like all of this stuff. What I would submit to you is it ends up being easier to work with those people. It's easier to take the company that doesn't have any of this and get them to do it the right way than it is to take people who have had potentially even decades of all of the right pieces fighting with each other, not working together in a successful way, and then like fighting our way out of that deficit towards something that actually works, right? We work with those clients, we'll take them on, but oh my God, it is way harder than the clients who just have never done this before and they're willing to like do it right the first time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've got two more questions for you. The first one is, in your book, you talk a bit about what meal kit companies and why they struggle so much. And that sort of resonated with me because I always think like, I don't understand how these companies make money. It just seems so working against our own kind of psychology. And I wondered if you could kind of explain a bit more about that from your experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because one of the great things about writing a book is, it's a static moment in time, right? It's this moment in time. And then you get to see how well the things that you're saying bear out over time. So as the death of meal kits and the rise of frozen meals, right? Like there were a million meal kits companies that rose and fell, and now we're in the swing of like, no, it's frozen meals. It's already, it's overnight oats. It's like it's one thing already made, super easy, super fast, factor meals. There's a million meal plans. People just realize like people don't really want to do that.
No.
There's another actually bit in the book that I'm watching right now and loving, where I talk about why I think Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton, and about sort of identity as one of the most powerful promoting and inhibiting pressures, right? And that need to be unique and that need to be special versus, sort of the need to fit in. And, if you looked at a Clinton, in the book, I talk about how if you look at a Clinton rally, it's about how unique is my sign, how pithy is my sign differently than your sign, right? And how am I unique and special snowflakey versus your unique and special snowflakey? And then, a Trump rally is they're all in the same hat, they're all in the same shirt, it's all the same slogan, right? You have a whole movement, right, that we now abbreviate as MAGA, like come out of one slogan, right? And you can identify with that singular thing. So now fast forward, 8 years later, or 5 years later, whatever we're at here. And now we have Kamala as a potentially very, very interesting challenger to Trump and hopefully our next president. And, it's been a very compressed timeline here in the United States for her to campaign, right? Because of the transition from Biden to her and et cetera. And from moment one, it was identity politics. It was black women for Kamala, white women for I had to go to New York recently, and my co-parent, we were going to pick up my kiddo from camp. My co-parent was flying out to New York, and she was wearing a Kamala sweatshirt. And guy got on the plane, long gray beard, kind of bigger guy, and he's staring at her sweatshirt as he's like coming down the aisle towards her. And she's like, oh man, like this is not gonna go well. And when he gets to her seat, he leans over and he says, I'm a white guy for Kamala. And I was like, oh, wow.
That's
funny, my book has been vindicated, right? Like I have called it. I think that that tribalism, that want to fit in, that like we're all for the, that it's the perfect blend of special snowflake, but in a blizzard, right? It appeals to your individual identity, white man versus black woman or whatever, right? Like, LGBTQ plus tribe, plus all, like all of the things, but united around a common purpose, right? So it's like, it's special, but it's not that special. It's not like my special pithy individual sign. But it's like, so now if you look at a Kamala rally, you'll see like, instead of infinite variety, it's still much more it's not everybody wearing the same color and the same t-shirt, which is Trump rally and is scary. It's, 12 or 15 major colors. Right. Like all in support of the same thing, but like united around a common purpose. I think that is totally interesting. And so, anytime you make predictions in the world, you get a chance to see them. And I'm frequently wrong. There are lots of things, a lot of my predictions are hopeful in nature, right? There's, you want to believe that the arc of the world will bend towards the thing that you care about. So,
and you'd be a very rich man if you could predict the future.
I'm not a very rich man. I give most of my money away. I'm a terrible poker player. This one always surprises people. I think people are like, behavioral scientist, you should be analyzing me. You should be. I'm terrible poker player. I get too distracted by watching people and not watching the cards at all, and I'm terrible at odds, and I'm just a terrible poker player. If you ever get in a game with me, we're playing for low stakes, man, because I will lose all of my money.
Well, you're going to beat me. I've never played poker, so I'm going to be even worse.
It's probably the wisest way to play poker is to not start at all.
Yeah, so I wouldn't know what's going on at all. And then the last question I had for you, because when you do apply behavioral science effectively, it's a pretty powerful tool, and I think there's obviously, ethical considerations in the sense that, if people aren't aware of how their choices are being kind of shaped, how do you kind of maintain that kind of ethical?
So there's a whole
approach.
chapter in the book. There's a whole chapter in the book. I think it's too nuanced and complex for a senior question like you and I could do a whole podcast on it. I will say, I think two things. The number one solution that I know of is diversity and public exposure, right? So the more people look at something, the more people are likely to detect the biases that are outside, because if one person sees it, they've got all their own biases. Two people see it, but they're from the same context, they're likely to replicate the biases, right? And so the more diversity that I can get is just the more surface area for finding the bugs and the holes in the place that I need to do things. And the more likely that someone will raise their hand and go, hey man, this is maybe not a great idea. So that's one. In terms of the mistake that I actually see most often happening these days, there's a tremendous number of well-intentioned companies doing well-intentioned things, but they don't consider the sort of like zero-sum implications of the thing that they're doing. So I'll give you the example. I was working with a company the other day, and they're like, we're writing a behavioral statement around working out.
Right.
And, I asked them to describe the future world they wanted. And, they were sort of like, people work out regularly all the time, et cetera. And I said, okay, well, what if Jake has only an hour of free time a day and you want him to work out for an hour? Are you saying you'd rather have him work out for an hour than play with his 3.5-year-old? And they're like, no.
Right.
Of course, I'd rather that he played with his 3.5-year-old. And I was like, well, then you need to rethink how you're expressing this desire that you have, how this fits into people's lives, right? It's not exercise at all costs, right? It's like in a reasonable way, in a reasonable space, but people don't think about that, right? If we just took all of the camps of people who are trying to get me to do something, cook your own food, exercise, play with your kid, take time for yourself, read, like all of the camps of health activities that you want me to do, I'd never get any work done, right? Like there has to be some balance, some complexity to that system. And I think people get so, because of the nature of behavioral science, which asks you to consider behaviors in isolation during the process of causing the behavior. So during the process of trying to create the behavior, you have to look at it in isolation. That's the nature of anything. It's the nature of how science works, right? We have to control the situation. But in that strategy portion, in that beginning part where we're picking the behaviors, we need to articulate carefully how they fit into a wider web of behaviors. And there's people like Steve Wendell, who has pivoted his career to more looking at this like more systemic, wider web approach that I think can be very, very important. So from an ethical perspective, I think the best solution is diversity and exposure. And I think the thing I would direct people to that they're probably not paying enough attention to is what is the opportunity cost of the behavior that you are talking about, right? In the book, we talk about, you can't create a behavior where the cost to another behavior is unacceptably high to the person, right? And usually as humans, we're pretty good at detecting these if we articulate them. So if I articulate to Jake, hey, in order to work out an hour today, you're going to have to spend an hour less with your kid. Jake is pretty good at going, well, that's not what I want to do. So can I incorporate my kid, or can I make it half an hour, or can I, what can we do to sort of resolve this, this paradox? And so I think that's the place I would redirect people.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think opportunity cost is massive. And another thing that you're not really taught at school, or you don't naturally think about it. And yet it's such a big part of your life, in choosing to do one thing, you're necessarily choosing not to do something else.
And you can't let that destroy your ability to make decisions in the world, right? You don't want to go into vapor lock. But as people who are designing for systemic behavior, we sort of have to be long-termist about these things. It is not long-term good for Jake to exercise a lot and not pay attention to his kids. Like, that is long-term bad.
Right.
And so, I think of all of the destructive systems, I think the stock market has lots of things going for it. But of all the destructiveness, this notion of like quarter over quarter returns and growth always happens on short time frames, and sort of it always has to go up and to the right, and we can never have long-termist views of things. That is it is the anti-behavioral science, because it will just force you to look at behaviors that are too isolated and too disparate, such that it'll destroy our long-term ability to be happy.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I think long-term thinking is another thing we don't do enough of. So that's a topic for another day. But apart from your wonderful book, we always like to sort of finish with a book recommendation. So I guess, for people wanting to learn more about applying behavioral science in their organizations, apart from your book, obviously, are there any other books or resources you recommend? I mean, it can be anything. It can be podcasts, books, websites.
I mean, rather in lieu of doing a second book, we sort of did this Google Doc. So we have this ever evolving Google Doc of like, that lives at Applied B-Side Teams, where we sort of talk more about team stuff. In terms of process oriented stuff, I really like Amy Bucher's book. I think it's a very, very strong articulation of a process orientation towards behavioral science, especially in sort of health behavior change, which is a big bulk of behavior change. So I think Amy's book is the one that I would most recommend.
Do you know what that is off the top of your head?
It's designing. It's called Engaged: Designing for Behavior Change.
Oh, okay, cool.
And it's great. I think it's a great book, and I think Amy does really fantastic work, and she's doing some great work around AI and behavioral science right now, and sort of the combination of sort of how do we use generative AI in B-side ways. I think she's really pushing the field forward. And there's a lot of, really, really wonderful behavioral scientists. I think it's a space where people, thankfully, there's not too many books. I mean, I think there's all the phenomenological books, but I think those are fun to read as pop psych books, but I don't think they teach anything. But I think the process-oriented ones really, like Amy's book or Stephen Wendell's book, which is, I think, maybe on the second or third edition at this point. Like, I would always look more for the handbooky things than the phenomenology, nudge, Dan Ariely kind of versions of the world, which are fun. I get it. I get why it's entertaining, but it's entertainment. It's not.
Yeah, it's the practice versus theory. I mean, I guess you can say those books are helpful in the sense that they get people into the topic, get people interested in it, and kind of put it out
we always talk about
academia.
All behavior change is a competition between promoting pressures and inhibiting pressures, right? Reasons to do something, reasons not to do something. Dan's books, Nudge book, etc. They're really good at promoting pressures. They get people interested in the topic. But what you really need is the books that reduce the inhibiting pressures, that make it easier for you to actually implement this, right? And so I think Katie Milkman does a good job of that on the individual level. Like if you're interested in changing your own behavior, I think Katie does really good work on like, how do you change your own behavior? I think Amy and I and Steve have done work more on the, like, how do you change other people's behavior? But like, I always are going to gravitate towards those books that are primarily about reducing inhibiting pressures, that are about making it easier to do the thing. If you're already convinced that behavioral science is worthwhile, that you want to change behavior, to me, I don't know that we need more salespeople of that. When I explain my career at cocktail parties to people, almost everyone can articulate how they wish they could change their own or someone else's behavior. But that's something we all intuitively want. I don't know that we need to sell wanting that, right? We just need to make it easier for people to do. And so focusing on that inhibiting pressure is key. And that, that is its own form of bias. So we've done some work in my lab where we've showed that, if I say, Jake, get people to do behavioral science more, you'll generate promoting pressures. Get people to eat more M&Ms, you'll generate promoting pressures. I say, get people to do something less, stop smoking. You generate inhibiting pressures. You say, I'll tell them all about how it's going to kill them and I'll make them really expensive, et cetera. But that's only half the equation, right? Part of getting people to do good behavioral science is making it easier to do. Part of getting people to stop smoking is stop promoting smoking, right? Not allowing advertising, not allowing those promoting pressures in the first place. So that making sure that you're addressing both sides when we talk about, I mean, look, even if you go take my online course, right? There's tons of jokes. There's lots of things designed to make it fun and promoting. But at the end of the day, the thing that will determine whether you do behavioral science or not is how easy I can make it. Can I explain a model that the average person can take up and use without a PhD, without any of these sort of, without anything crazy or big? Can they just do it? And that's what I always am striving for. That's my mission in life, is like, I want to find models that everyone can use.
I think that's a great place to stop and say a huge thank you. Really enjoyed having you on the podcast, and thanks for your time and sharing some of your wisdom.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for telling me a little bit about your move to Australia and back again, and your kiddo. You'll have to keep us posted on child development. Always the best. The book starts and ends with my son, because there's nothing quite that highlights behavior change quite like a kiddo.
I will do. Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this 42 Courses podcast. If you did, please like and share. Any comments are also very, very welcome. And of course, if you want to learn more about us, visit our website at 42courses.com. Thanks again.